I'm Joan Chambers. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing and Outreach for CISCRP, the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation. CISCRP is a nonprofit organization dedicated to increasing awareness and transparency around clinical research. As we look to the next slide, today's webinar is part 2 in a 3-part series on navigating rare disease and clinical research. Every patient matters. We are pleased to be presenting today's webinar in collaboration with NORD, National Organization for Rare Disorders. NORD, a nonprofit organization, is a patient advocacy organization dedicated to people with rare disease and the organizations that serve them. NORD, along with its more than 300 patient organization members, is committed to the identification, treatment, and cure of rare disorders through programs of education, advocacy, research, and patient services. Today's webinar is being recorded. We invite and encourage you to submit questions in the question and answer in the entire webinar today. As we look on the next slide, I'm going to cover quickly the agenda. We will look at a brief recap of webinar number 1, which focused on rare disease clinical trials being informed. This webinar covered the clinical research basics, along with a facilitated conversation with panelists on a variety of topics that included what to expect the first day of your clinical trial visit, ways that barriers and challenges are being addressed for rare disease participants, and what to know if your child participated in a clinical trial, and many other topics. And a facilitated conversation was also held in webinar number 1, what to consider before the clinical trial. Actually, this webinar will focus on a panel discussion, what to consider before the clinical trial ends and how to plan, in addition to what happens at the end of the clinical trial. At this point, before I move on to the next slide, I'd like to start with a very quick poll to actually attend this event. So thank you for this poll. And if we go to the next slide, I'll focus on the key takeaways. Today's webinar, the key takeaways will focus on what happens when the clinical trial is completed, things to consider, questions that you can ask, how to advocate yourself, or if you are, and hearing from the panelists today and patients about their experiences with this journey. So I'm going to end the poll. Thank you very much for completing the poll. And I do see that we have some really good attendance from the parent, the caregiver, clinical research professionals, and members of the general public. Moving on to the next slide. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator and our panelists. Marcia Lanes, the genetic counselor and medical editor of NORD, will be our moderator. And Marcia develops educational resources and programs related to rare disorders for patients, caregivers, medical professionals, and students preparing for healthcare careers. Dr. Tracy Dixon Salazar is executive director of the LGS Foundation. Tracy has implemented a strategic vision to build collaboration across the epilepsy and rare disease to advance the mission of understanding the science behind LGS. Tracy is an accomplished neuroscientist and geneticist. She is also an epilepsy and rare disease patient advocate, particularly driven by her daughter's diagnosis of LGS. Welcome, Tracy. Richie Kahn, Senior Director, Patient Engagement with Medable. Richie is a health policy professional by training, clinical researcher by trade, and patient advisor by necessity. He is intensely passionate about incorporating patient and caregiver perspectives into the clinical development process and ultimately reducing the time it takes to bring promising new therapeutics and diagnostics to market. Our next panelist, Dana Halaka, is an operating board member of TSC Alliance. And Dana is an experienced advocate in championing the needs of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, mainly within the TSC communities. Dana has been involved with the TSC Alliance for 20 years, currently as an outreach chair of its board of directors, and driven by her daughter's complex medical needs, Dana takes pride in providing the best resources and offers her knowledge to others. As a reminder, please submit your questions in the question and answer box throughout the webinar. We will address them during the facilitated panel discussion moderated by Marcia. So let's look at a brief recap of webinar number 1. The first webinar, Rare Disease Clinical Trials Being Informed, as we look at the next slide, this webinar covered the clinical research basics, the process, who is involved, the safeguards in place, the questions to ask when considering to participate in a clinical trial. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar also focused on having a facilitated conversation with panelists, which covered a variety of topics: what to expect the first day of your clinical trial visit, ways that barriers and challenges are being addressed for rare disease participants, and what to know if your child participates in a clinical trial. And that facilitated conversation covered a variety of other topics. When we look at the next slide, the first webinar also focused on a clinical trial is not the same as standard of care. And it's really important to understand that being in a clinical trial is not the same as going to your doctor for care. When you go to your doctor, they will give you a treatment that has already been tested and approved by the government. This is called routine or standard of care. And this care, we know, works for most people. It's the care that you normally go to for your doctor for regular appointments, or if you have a health. Before participating, the study protocol has specific guidelines to follow, includes the inclusion and exclusion criteria, and this really helps to ensure the clinical trial is conducted and managed objectively, along with ensuring diverse populations. So the goal of many clinical trials is that the drug is being studied effectively enough to a point that someday it does become standard of care for the general public and a standard of care option. As we look at the next slide, the first webinar also focused on elements to consider before participation. Your homework, learn a lot about the clinical trial and ask questions. Read all about the information provided by the study team. Feel comfortable asking members of the healthcare team questions about the clinical trial, the care that's going to be expected, and even the cost. Be prepared meeting with principal investigator and or research coordinator study team. And if you do your study, you should have made a decision, and you should let the clinical trial staff for you and answer your question. Brief overview. Again, this second webinar brings us to the second phase of when you are in a clinical trial and when it is starting to come to a close, what elements do you need to consider to start planning? What are some of those questions that you need to start thinking about in the middle or the close to the end of trials? So at this juncture, I'd like to turn it over to moderate and facilitate the conversation with Dana, Tracy, and Richie. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those introductions, Joan, and for inviting me to moderate the SysScript webinar on this very important topic for rare disease patients and families. Welcome to all of our audience members who've joined us today. I saw from the poll results that were posted up there real quickly that we have a nice mix of patients, caregivers, parents, healthcare providers, clinical researchers. So we're so glad that you're able to join us here today. And please do feel free to submit questions to our panelists in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're very fortunate to have Tracy, Dana, and Richie with us today to share their knowledge and experience about what to consider and how to plan before a clinical trial ends, as well as what happens at the end of the clinical trial. So we'll get the conversation started with our first question. How will the trial participants' care be transitioned after the trial ends? And Tracy, I'm going to ask you to lead off with this, and then we'll see if Dana and Richie would like to weigh in as well.
I muted myself. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I mean, after a trial ends, it's kind of a big deal because you were getting all of this, high level of care, right? And you have probably gone, I mean, depending on the setup of the trial, there was probably we do have done a lot of crossover trials. So at one point we were on placebo, at one point we're on actual treatment. And, now you're transitioning out of that. And so as a caregiver, I have a daughter who's been in a number of clinical trials. The questions are, I think no matter where you are always the same. They're about access. Am I still going to have access? What was my loved one on, right? Were they on placebo? Were they on treatment? If it was a crossover study, at which point were they on that? What about care now, right? Because you've been going to the hospital. For us, we always had lots of hospital visits, lots of tests, lots of doctors helping us every step of the way. And now we're just going to be kind of thrown back out into the world to figure things out for ourselves. But we have a treatment that hopefully if it was working, we would still have access to that. And, we're basically thinking, okay, is this going to be a problem? How are you going to work with our primary provider to make sure that there's no gap if this is something we want to stay on? Is it going to be covered? Are we going to be able to pay for this? How long do we get access? Can I talk about the trial now? And then, what's going to happen to the data that was generated? Are you going to move this forward? So I think no matter where you are, where you live, if you're a patient who's actually in the trial, or if you're a caregiver, that we all tend to have the same exact questions, right? But how they might be answered and how they might be solved depends on maybe regionally where we live or who our insurance provider is in the States. And so thinking about transitioning is, I think, a really anxious time for patients and families, and really having those conversations starting early about the questions that we're all going to have. Access, who's going to pay for it, what we're on, where'd the data go, what happens next, I think is really important.
Thanks, Tracy. Richie or Dana, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure, I'll hop in, Marcia. Great answer, Tracy. You touched on a number of interesting things. One that I was thinking about, is really preparing yourself to advocate either as a patient or as a caregiver, for a friend or loved one participating, and doing it early. So one of the resources I came across actually while thinking about this webinar is a guide from Clara Health, What Happens After a Clinical Trial Ends. So I think as much reading as you can do before you participate, as you're weighing participation and thinking about the informed consent process, the better likelihood you're going to get all of those questions answered on the front end. So wanted to be sure to share that.
Thank you very much.
The only thing I think I would add is just really don't think any question is silly, stupid, or dumb, because you're going to go into this feeling like you have no control after you've been taken care of and guided along, and now you're like, what am I doing? So you definitely don't think that any question you have is stupid, because it's a good question to ask.
Great point.
Very important point. And our next question, which is somewhat related to the first question, is it possible to continue to receive care from the providers at the study site, either in person or remotely, after the trial ends? Tracy, do you want to lead us off on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question. People who are conducting clinical trials are the best of the best. They're going to know very much about the research, very much about the treatment that you're on. They're going to know a lot about the process. But our experiences in the multiple trials that we've done have always been that we were, if we could stay, if our insurance was now going to cover, right? So we live in the States, United States, and if our insurance was going to cover it, then we can stay. And we had to work that out. It really fell to us to work that out. Now we're moving into more of a care team plan. It used to be that the philosophy in our community was very much, I have to go find the best provider and I constantly have to go to them. And it's just not realistic. Sometimes you don't live in the provider who knows the most is in another state or in another place. And so we've really kind of started thinking about the care team. Whom is my home neurologist? Neurology is the main area for Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, the disease my daughter has, which is a lot of neurological symptoms. And then how can we incorporate this expert opinion into the team? But it really is, it's like everything in rare disease. It falls back to us as the caregivers or the patients to be the quarterback and, oh, can it get covered? And how do we do that? So again, I think starting the conversations early and thinking about those. And these are questions, that now clinical trials used to be designed and created by physicians and scientists. And now that patients have joined the conversation, a lot of these questions are being asked up front. We just had a clinical trial where the trial ended and open label, I saw this was one of the questions in the chat, but open label extension was not offered and neither was expanded access in our disease state, but in another disease state, it was offered. And so as patients sort of go through trials and they start to learn what questions to ask, they're asking these questions up front and it's starting to dictate whether or not they say yes to a trial. I think this idea that patients absolutely get nothing out of a trial is kind of shifting a little bit, where it's like, yes, we do want to advance science. We're definitely in this for altruistic reasons, but at the same time, maybe trials haven't worked with the patient as mind as well as they could have. And how can we make them better together? I think is something that's shifting a little bit.
Great points. Dana or Richie, would you like to add to that?
I just have to agree that I think it is definitely going towards more patient involvement in those decisions. And I think that's something that has needed to be done for a long time. So I totally agree with that. And I think that makes a big difference in the end run for everybody involved, especially your children. So definitely.
Yeah, completely agree, Tracy and Dana. And obviously I'm approaching this as a rare disease patient myself, but when I'm not wearing that hat, I'm working as a clinical researcher focused on exactly what you're saying, working to incorporate that patient and caregiver perspective. On that note, whether you can continue receiving care from the PI you're working with at the clinical research site, for years, and it's definitely different with rare disease as opposed to some other indications. I think a lot of the best of the best for rare disease are key opinion leaders or often at large academic medical centers. But for other indications, the way it typically would work, is you might get referred out to a research site and the community clinician maybe you or your loved one was seeing was not participating in research themselves, but they were always really hesitant to make that connection for fear that the patient wouldn't come back. But, it's ultimately always going to be up to us as the patient or the caregiver, so long as we're able to get an appointment and afford the bill. But one of the things you mentioned, Tracy, that I was thinking about, I think kind of that hub and spoke model for care is an important one for a lot of rare disease patients. So where I am right now, the quarterback of my care is at Washington University, St. Louis. I'm in Durham, North Carolina. He's a specialized endocrinologist, but I've got my team of my ophthalmologist here, my neuro-ophthalmologist in Pennsylvania, a neurologist in Raleigh. So it's really kind of fitting them all together and figuring out who can quarterback that care and really do the best to advocate for me and who's willing to really see me as an important player in that care process.
Thank you all for those very valuable insights. We'll move on to another question. If a trial participant received an investigational medication during the course of the study and believe that they've benefited, is there a mechanism in place that will allow them to stay on treatment? And I know, Richie, you expressed interest in tackling this one straight away.
Sure. Thanks, Marcia. So sponsors aren't necessarily bound to continue providing access after a study ends, but when you're having that conversation during the informed consent process, and within that informed consent form itself, all this should be outlined whether or not treatment will be made available post-study. So it's always a good place to check. And of course, if you're not sure, you can always reach out to your site, your coordinator, your PI. Oftentimes, Tracy, I think you were talking about this earlier, there are open label follow-ups, long-term extensions, and a couple other possibilities as well, where sometimes an investigational product will be made available after the trial wraps. And that's especially common after early phase and first in human trials.
Thank you. Dana or Tracy, any other remarks on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Richie raises some really good points about knowing again up front what the plan is. And there's nothing that it requires a sponsor of a clinical trial, whether it's a drug or device, to make the product available after. And you never really know when you're going to a trial how it's going to play out, right? I mean, maybe it really doesn't perform well. And at that point, the data shows that it needs to be removed. And we've seen this in our community where there was a clinical trial and a couple of kids did really well on something, but the majority of them did not do well on something. And so the trial ended and the product was, removed because scientifically it didn't show to be valuable in a large number of population. And the patients were devastated because it had shown some meaningful improvement in their loved one's life. And so I think that really thinking through those questions. I work in a community where our kids are having seizures every day. And a good seizure day for my daughter, was 5 to 10 seizures, and a bad seizure day was hundreds too many to count. And even though she had tried and failed more than 26 different treatments, drugs, diets, divisive, alternative therapies, she was still having seizures. So for us, when you run out of options, a clinical trial is hope, is light at the end of the tunnel. And we understand that. We understand that as our parents. And so we're willing to absorb a lot more risk. But I think a lot of times we went into trials in the past not knowing, oh my gosh, this isn't going to be offered at the end. Oh my gosh, I'm not going to have continuity of care. My insurance isn't going to pay for this. Oh, they're going to offer an open extension, but no one's going to pay for it. And so we sort of learned the hard way. And so I think this kit that Richie talked about, where you just up front, you learn from the experience of other patient advocates, and you ask the questions and you realize how much risk you're willing to absorb. And for me, it's a lot because again, my kid is very, very sick and we're losing her and she's dying. And so we're able to take on, but I think just knowing up front has always been the important thing. And then one other thing I would say is that as patient advocates, it's not an us versus them thing, right? Like we're not going to get to better treatments and cures without physicians and industry partners and pharmaceutical companies and device makers. We want to help you do it faster and smarter. We want to save you time and money. We're not in there to make things, harder for you, but we literally, with our input, you really could speed up enrollment and answer these questions up front in an honest way. And I think that all of us on this call are part of the group of people that are trying to streamline that process and make it easier. And I never want to come off as sounding like blame or, we can do this without you, because we can't. But we also want to be a part of the process. So.
Very important feedback, everyone. And here's a related question regarding access to medication. Does the drug manufacturer have a plan to assist families with the extra cost of the medication after the trial ends? Richie, do you want to start us out with that one?
Sure. And apologies in advance, everybody. I feel like I'm going to be the lawyer on all of these by going, it kind of depends. But, in the case here, it sort of depends on whether or not the product is already approved and marketed. So Tracy, I think you touched on this earlier, but obviously one of the key draws for a lot of patients for clinical research is that access to the high quality care that comes along with participation. And we already talked about, the struggle to potentially continue accessing care of that quality after study ends. But, think about the trials maybe you or a loved one have participated in, where maybe they're on the approved standard of care and they're doing pretty well. Study comes to an end, and that standard of care is a tremendous amount of money, right? So in the case of these products that are already marketed, there may be some issues of affordability. There are a number of tools that are made available. So states typically have medication assistance programs. A lot of biopharmaceutical companies, drug sponsors, study sponsors will have their own program. RX Assist is another one. And then I think partnership for prescription assistance. But again, those are all going to be specific to what's already approved and marketed. In terms of, if you're participating in a trial for an investigational product that's not yet approved and you feel like you've done well, it's making a difference for your loved one. There are a number of mechanisms where some pharmaceutical companies might be able to intervene and continue providing that investigational product after the study wraps up. And of course, there's sometimes the possibility of continued clinical trial participation as well in a future program.
Thanks, Richie. Dana or Tracy, any additional information from your perspectives on that?
No, I mean, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dana. Did you want to?
No, I was just going to say, I think you guys are covering it very well. Go ahead.
I think that that sponsors for clinical trials really do want to do what's right for patients, and they want to make it available. But at times, the bottom line is getting approval for something that's not approved, and they answer to shareholders, right? They also, the way that things are set up in this country, which I personally find frustrating, but also I have to operate in a system that as it is and not as I would change it to be. I can't fix capitalism, right? But they answer to a shareholder system. And so, I think that just understanding where you align and where you can help and where you can't. I'm happy to see that the field is shifting. We're all patient advocates on this call. So we're sitting here talking about, how we can advocate and how we could try to bring the patient voice to the table. And I feel like so many more sponsors and so many more contract research organizations and groups are listening to us and really valuing the patient input. But at the end of the day, they might not have the money. They might not have the backing of leadership, but most of what I have seen in the more than 20 companies that we've worked with across the last 10 years is that they really are trying to do the right thing. And when they can't align with the needs of the patient, it's usually because there's no way for them to do it. They've tried everything and they can't. So again, it's about us really mobilizing, knowing what questions we're going to ask up front, know what we're signing up for before we sign up for it. I think enough of us have been through it to create these guides and things to answer these questions. And then just knowing that they really are trying. The majority of them, 99% of them are really trying to make it so there's open access, so there's expanded access. And you can sit down and have these conversations with them too and say, listen, I think this is really important that you do this. Patients will not enroll in your trial if you don't have like a response to this question and things like that. So.
Yeah, and Tracy, one quick thing to add to that, I started smiling when he talked about cost, resources. I think it was just about 2 months ago for Patients as Partners, Ken Getz was presenting some research, finally getting quantitative about the value of working with patient advisory boards across phase 3 programs. And yeah, it costs money, but I think on average, you were able to go from 3.6 protocol amendments down to 2.6. You were able to streamline a ton of the data points. It wound up being a huge time savings, which is a cost savings as well. So I understand when, sponsors and CROs talk about, well, we don't have the resources, we don't have the money. Well, you're not willing to allocate it maybe upfront right now because you're not thinking about it that way. But if you're able to do this and you're able to streamline enrollment and you're able to bring it in early, that could save weeks or months. And it's a huge win for the patients those companies serve.
Thank you all. And here's one more related question regarding medication access. If the participant hasn't received an investigational medication during the course of the study, is there a way to request access? I know you've all touched on that a bit, but if there's any other information that you would like to expand on for that one. Tracy, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, there's always a chance to ask, if I think we're really moving away in the epilepsy and seizure space from, single arm trials to more of a crossover study and the trials have really been shortened because the disease is so severe. So they used to be much, much longer. And we've been doing this, my daughter's 28. So we've been doing this for many, many decades at this point. So I've seen several iterations of trials. And so, when we've been in the placebo arm, you can definitely go in and ask. And it's like one of those things where, boy, I really wish I had asked this up front. I feel like everything we've learned over the last 2 decades has been sort of like, oh yeah, I wish I had thought of that. Let me write that down for the next generation, right? Kind of thing, or for the next time we agree to a trial. And I think it's important. I think that moreover, scientists are trying to get the most bang out of their buck and try to do these crossover studies where maybe in the beginning, for the first number of weeks, you're on placebo, and then at a certain point, but you don't know this, right? You're just on arm one, and then you switch, and then you're on the drug for the second arm, right? And so you get a chance to be on both, and they've collected that data. If that's not, you can certainly talk about what your options are going to be at the end, because if they have an open access program at the end of the trial, then I think it's really important that you would get access to the medication. And it's one of the reasons why we do this. We don't sign up to be on a trial because our kids are healthy or we're healthy and we want to just go on, a sugar pill, right? And so sponsors really do try to make that happen as much as possible for the families.
Thanks so much, Tracy. Anything else, Dana or Richie, you want to add to that?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. All right. Now, shifting gears a little bit to thinking about what happens at the end of the trial. We have some questions related to this. What types of follow-up might be recommended after the trial, such as labs, scans, etc., in terms of medical care for you or your child? And Dana, I'm going to go to you first off for this one.
Thanks, Marcia. I think it really depends on the actual kind of trial that you're in. With us, this experience that we've had with my daughter being on a drug study, we wanted to find out, like, afterwards, kind of realizing that we're not going to be held hands all the way down the line now. It's kind of, you're done, this is what we need to do. So we had to figure out what the game plan was going to be. And so, knowing, do we need to have blood drawn? Does it need to be every 6 months? Does it need to be, does she need to fast? All the different kinds of questions you need to ask as far as, like, if there's labs that need to be done, scans. With one of the drugs that my daughter was on, we did scans afterwards because we wanted to actually see if the tumors were shrinking from the medication that she was taking. So that was another one that they had said, that might be a possibility. Follow up with, the neurologist or whoever it was at the time. So I think it's really important to ask those questions and to know, because for you going into this by yourself now on this drug, you need to have kind of a game plan, so knowing what needs to be done ahead of time kind of, gets you prepared for what you need to do down the line. So I don't know if there's any other input from Rich or Tracy, but that's kind of my thought on it.
I would just add that, we had a similar experience. So after a trial of a new medicine, so not something that's being repurposed and FDA approved, but something that's new, that's coming out, there's new data that's constantly coming out about that. And I think the most relevant is that in Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, we have a drug that's generated from the marijuana plant, from the cannabis plant. It's CBD, and it's called Epidiolex, which there's only one, but it's cannabidiol is the drug. And when it came out, our kid, it's add-on therapy to a bunch of other anti-seizure medicines, right? And when it came out, we didn't know how it interacted with all of the 40 plus other meds on the market for seizures. And that data was more forthcoming as time went on. So you need to still be plugged into a center who is going to be on top of that knowledge. You can't just kind of go back to your family doctor who's not going to be thinking about that, but you need to be thinking about the new knowledge that's coming out, because we quickly learned that there were certain medicines that needed to be reduced if you were going to be on this medicine, and there were interactions and there were more than one. So I think thinking about that too, you still want to be tapping into the expert again, right? And honestly, when you have a rare disease and a really sick kid, as sick as our kid is, it makes sense to be seeing a specialist in your very severe rare disease where your life is threatened on a regular basis. And so hopefully you have that kind of care. But then, it's like, I don't want to have to go to the health center expert neurologist that, every time my kid's got the sniffles either, right? Or needs to go on birth control pills or, these kinds of things, but still happy tapping into that network, thinking about the care team as a whole, and then making sure that if you're on this drug, that the team has a way to get that information to the person who's doing the major management.
And I have to add to that, because that is one of the actual things we are doing right now. We are doing the Epidiolex. And I won't go there as far as the experience, but I'll tell you, it's been very hard, very, very hard. And learning that we needed to go down on a certain medication, we had to learn that. But the one thing, when you're talking about the networking, it is great to have the doctors, but I'm telling you what, the parents and having those connections in the community has helped us immensely. The last 2 weeks and even today have been super difficult. And if it weren't for some of these other families having already experienced that and saying, this is what you kind of need to do, has helped us. But you know, it's an ongoing, you know, every single day is a different day. But that is huge. I mean, that's something we'll probably touch on at the end too, but connecting with other families or other people who are experiencing that is huge. You can get some of the best information and take it for what you want to take it for, but it has helped us immensely in those situations. So definitely.
I agree. Our community is really our guide in so many ways because somebody's been through it. And oftentimes you'll find out that their doctor has sought out an answer already to a question, right? Like, oh my gosh, I'm seeing increased seizures with this addition of a medicine. Oh, did you know that there's this paper? Share this paper with your doctor, right? Like, so it really does, because it's directly affecting our lives, right? You know, and so we're seeking the answers. So I totally agree with you, Dana.
Absolutely.
Anything to add, Richie, on that subject?
Yeah, just one quick comment. Number one, Dana, as you're saying, I think connecting with other patients, caregivers, families going through what you're going through is fantastic from a support perspective. But the other thing, and Tracy, you kind of just alluded to this, you know, there's no need for you to recreate the wheel. So if you can learn from what others have already done as far as down titration of medication and other things to consider, some of the things that maybe your care team, your docs know, but they're not really thinking about because they're not going through this every day, it can just make your life a lot easier. So wholeheartedly endorse that suggestion, connecting with networks of folks like you.
So important to emphasize. Thank you all. So another question regarding what happens at the end of the clinical trial. Is there a local representative from the pharmaceutical company who could help with questions or concerns? Dana, do you want to respond to that one first off?
Absolutely, I will, Marcia. I think it's really imperative that you kind of make those connections. You can make it at the beginning, you know, when you're in the trial, or, you know, some of the questions towards the end, but to find out who that person is locally. And if they don't know, you know, maybe they can refer you to their website. But I think having somebody local, you know, even though it is quote unquote the drug company, they can still offer things. They have the experience because they've actually interacted with other parents and other caregivers and, you know, people who are involved in the studies. That may be the same thing of being able to pass down some, you know, knowledge that we didn't know about or whatnot. But also being able to have that access with them. For instance, if you needed, you know, like we were talking about resources to help with funding, you know, maybe they offer coupons or, you know, those kinds of connections you could make. They're also very good to build on that relationship, you know, because if you were to do any kind of fundraising, to be able to have that kind of relationship with the sponsor, I have them as a sponsor, excuse me, for that kind of thing, and having them be able to connect with other families, you know, in a bigger scale, you know, at walks or whatever, is a good resource because there's more than you out there wanting to know questions that the drug company could answer. So that's kind of my thought on that. If anybody else has anything to add.
Yeah, I think most of the groups that we've worked with always have somebody, you know, if you know, there's always a liaison that's trying to help you, you know, and they're shifting, right? So after the trial, they're shifting to either down phase the trial because it wasn't scientifically successful. Remember, trials, depending on how they're designed, right? It's a little different if it's an N of 1 trial, but in general, trials have been designed, the ones that we participate in for seizures, around a response by a significant number of people, a significant response by a significant number of people, not a single response by a single person. And so there might be downshifting or there might be upshifting to apply for FDA approval. And so, you know, figuring out who your contact is, I think, is really important. I think that, you know, that if they're moving towards approval, then they're really going to want to keep you on and keep the data coming in. It's always a harder transition when they're moving out. I think that thinking about the changing roles, a lot of times we've worked with an industry partner where you might get a different person, you know, as they shift in this. You remember the company's now going through a complete shift, right? To oh my gosh, we were just in a phase 3 clinical trial or in a phase 2 clinical trial, and now we're gearing up for this next phase. And so just kind of being patient with them as they move things forward. And then being as connected as you can. We had one drug where it was a nasal spray to stop clusters of seizures, right? So, and the question that came up in our community is, what if your kid sneezes right after it's given? So it's a nasal spray. It's a tiny, tiny amount. It's like maybe like, I don't know, 10 milliliters or something like, it's not even 10 milliliters, like 10 microliters or something like that. It's tiny. And so the kids were sneezing it out, but was it fast enough to be absorbed in the nasal membrane to get into the brain to stop the seizures? And there's literally really nobody that can answer that question except the company, right? They're at that point, they're the only one that has the data. And so while they're not going to answer that question directly, they will go to their doctor experts and start to try to find out. And so I think it's important to stay in contact with the companies.
Anything you'd like to add to that, Richie?
Yeah, I think staying in contact and making those connections with companies are huge. I had been trying to reach out to one particular company in my indication. I didn't really get anywhere. And I was on a panel like this a couple months ago, and I got a direct message from one of the attendees. I hadn't mentioned the indication by name. I hadn't mentioned that company by name. And she said, "Hi, I'm the head of medical affairs at the company you're talking about. Can we connect?" So now I have that direct point of contact.
Yeah.
And, you know, generally this is a very collegial industry, whether it's industry people wanting to help other industry people or industry people being in this industry because they want to make a difference in patient lives. I think for almost everyone, it really is all about making those connections for the good of the patient. So generally, if you can get to the right person, you're going to have a pretty warm reception, I think.
Thank you. That's good to hear. And here's a related question about reaching out to the sponsor. Can participants contact the trial sponsor to provide feedback about their clinical trial experience? Tracy, do you want to start us off on that one?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that you can provide feedback to the trial sponsors. I think you can provide feedback directly to the FDA as well through their like adverse events reporting online system if you want to go that route. I think that you can have conversations within your patient advocacy community, which I think I'd be lost without the LGS and community and the larger rare disease and epilepsy communities. I think you can talk about it within those to see if it's like a one-off response, an individual sort of a hypersensitivity, if it's a negative reaction or if it's a positive experience. There's not a lot, like if you're going to comment generally about the trial or about your experience, it's a little hard to comment after the fact, because the company is like kind of moving to the next phase. And so many companies end up hiring like a contract organization to run their trial. And so what we have found has been really successful is to start to talk to the contract organizations that actually run clinical trials and say, how are you incorporating the patient perspective? How can we help save you time and money? Because again, it comes back to saving time and money. We have the same goals. You want to enroll people in your trial and have a successful trial for better treatments and cures. We want you to enroll people in your trial to have a successful trial and find better treatments and cures. So it's really about the best way to do that by incorporating all the opinions. Providing feedback, I think, is important. I think providing to FDA, providing it to your community, providing it to the company, but also realizing that person you're talking to, like what is their power to change the system in the future for the better? You want to be talking to the right person.
For sure. Anyone else want to talk about that?
I think Marcia said it. Tracy, sorry, said it pretty good.
Yeah, just a couple of comments to add on. When you're talking about the contract organizations, Tracy, Tracy's talking about contract research organizations and CROs. So these are the companies that typically do the outsourced drug development. And I know we're going to talk about this in a bit, but oftentimes it's hard to figure out who that is. It's not necessarily listed on clinicaltrials.gov. You know, you might see, you will have the identity of the sponsor of the clinical trial, but sometimes it's going to take a lot of sleuthing. And even if you are able to figure out who the contract research organization is, they're often very large multinational organizations. So you might find the person who's involved with advocacy partnerships, and maybe they're the right person. Other times you might have to connect with the director of clinical operations, and you might find out they've got 38 of them. Same title, So again, I think a lot of it comes down to sleuthing and detective work. But when you are able to make those connections, I think it's a fantastic opportunity for everybody involved.
And in a way, that's my job, right? Like, so I'm the executive director at the LGS Foundation. Part of my job is answering the tough questions that come up, as it relates to trial, providing this feedback, figuring out who the CROs are, not so that we can fix something while it's going on. That's way too late. You got to get in earlier, right? And to advocate for the patient voice to be there. But I did just want to say something too. A lot of trials, you're really not supposed to be talking about your experience until a certain point too, right? So one of the things we monitor for very actively when trials are going on in our private support groups is conversations about response to the medicine. We know that you can create bias. If somebody comes in and is like, oh, my kid is doing horribly on this medicine, or oh, my kid's doing great, you can create a bias. And so you also want to make sure that it's okay for you to be talking about this at this point, right? The general rule is don't talk about your loved ones or your response to the treatment. Instead, talk about, I found that this process of 8 blood draws in an hour on the hour was ridiculous because no hospital is going to be on time with the blood draw, right? Like, you keep it more to the protocol or to the specific issue that you're having and not your loved one's direct response. And then you don't have to worry about biasing the trial before the data has been approved, and run through the FDA. So just wanted to mention that.
And here's a related question to continue this same topic. Will the results of the trial be shared with participants? And if so, how will they be shared? If not, why not? And where can participants go to find out the information? Richie, do you want to start us off with this one?
I would love to. I will also start you off, Marsha, with a caveat. We just got a little bit of thunder, so my dogs are probably going to go crazy in a minute.
Oh.
So short answer, yes, this information will be shared. You should be able to look it up theoretically on, say, clinicaltrials.gov, though admittedly that website leaves a bit to be desired. Certainly information about how to get this information, how it will be shared, who to talk to. This is all stuff that should be discussed and spelled out during informed consent when you're making that decision about whether or not you want to participate in a clinical trial. But I think one of the important things to keep in mind for most trials, you're going to have multiple sites or institutions involved. Some will start up enrolling patients faster than others. One country might start up in 3 months, others it might be 9 months. Enrollment might be faster in Sweden than it is in Guatemala. But I say all that because oftentimes you've got multiple institutions, hundreds and hundreds of patients, certainly smaller populations for some of the rare disease trials, but you have to wait for all of those sites to wrap up the research. Findings are going to be collated, they're going to be digested, analyzed, sliced and diced, and often shared through scientific materials, papers, abstracts, poster presentations. A lot of that information you can probably find from the advocacy groups and nonprofits in your respective indications and therapeutic areas. I mentioned clinicaltrials.gov again. PubMed is another good source as well. Last thing I wanted to mention, and I'm thrilled the dogs are not losing their minds here. Many sponsors will share this information directly with patients if you ask. So sometimes it's going to take some sleuthing again, but oftentimes if you just go to the clinical trial sponsors website and you see a news section, you might see a quote from Dr. Dixon Salazar, Dr. Lanes, whoever it is, and you can just figure out the email address and reach out directly, and they can usually point you in the right direction.
And I would just add, I know we're short on time, so I'll just be really quick, but generally, there have been times where when we enter a trial, we know that it's going to be aggregated health data, right? Like we're going to be a part of a population. So my own child's data isn't necessarily going to come back to me, but there have also been times where like, if we do an EEG or an MRI on my daughter, we have to sedate her. So that's a big problem. And so we've been able to go through the hospital, sort of not through the trial process, but through the hospital to request our records and be able to use those records in the future for our own personal use. Because it doesn't make sense to keep resedating her and doing these tests on her, which increases her risk of adverse effects. So there is a way to get some of the data, but generally it's going to be reported out, not as you as an individual, but you as part of a larger group who were tested.
Dana, do you want to add anything to that?
I don't.
All righty, next question. How can trial participants learn about any follow-up studies? Richie, do you want to start us off with that?
Sure, absolutely. So a couple thoughts here. Number one, oftentimes at the end of your trial participation, there's an opportunity to provide feedback. As Tracy mentioned, there's not necessarily a great mechanism to provide feedback on how your trial experience is going as the trial is progressing, unfortunately. But oftentimes you have this feedback session and exit interview kind of hybrid going on. And that's a good time to either ask about, or hopefully your site coordinator or PI will tell you about either theoretical trials that they're thinking about or planned programs that are not yet open to enrollment. They will often tell you about long-term follow-up studies, open access opportunities, things of that nature as well. And certainly if the sponsor's got nothing planned, they're waiting for an interim analysis or probably a longer term analysis as a result of the trial you've participated in, you can keep checking those resources we talked about earlier, or reach out directly as well.
Excellent. Dana or Tracy, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, follow-up studies, you can look at clinicaltrials.gov. You can look on the website, like Richie had said, for the organization. You know, a lot of the follow-up studies that will happen after a treatment have to do, we just had a study where they showed that an anti-seizure medicine also improved executive function in patients with LGS. And the drug isn't yet approved, but there was an expanded study that went on. So you can ask the sponsor, you can look at their site. It has to be on clinicaltrials.gov if it's something that's ongoing. So, and then you can talk to your advocacy organization too, because navigating those can be tricky, and they should be able to, help point you in the right direction.
Great, thank you. So we are running short on time, but we're going to try to squeeze in a couple more questions here. What resources are available to help pay for medications that become commercially available after this study? Dana, do you want to start us off with that one?
Yeah, thanks, Marcia. There's a couple things. I mean, I know we've touched on a few of them throughout the conversation, but definitely asking the pharmaceutical company if there's any kinds of coupons, available. And now there's so much advertisements and all that kind of stuff about RX, Good RX. I think that's one of them. RX Savers. In some states, I think Richie touched on this, that they have a MedAssist program. So you can go on your website, you can check out, each state is different. I know that. So if you pull up your state on all their information should come up, and if they have that. The other thing is if your child is on Medicaid or Medicare, whatever, there are ways that you can have assistance with that as well, by reaching out to your resource coordinator through your community center boards, those kinds of things. Those are also very good resources. And speaking with the local reps, they may have other resources available. There may even be that chance that your insurance company might have a lead on something that you're not sure of. You never know until you ask them. And then the other thing that I really, really state, and it's because of the connection I've made, with the communities that I've built, is reaching out to those other families and knowing. Not too long ago, I talked with a family, and I can't remember what it was about, but she was like, did you ever check out this website? And I was like, no, what is that? And I had never heard of it, but it was called needhelppayingbills.com. And that was something that went on and helped with different aspects. I mean, not just, coverage of medications and stuff, many other things. So just definitely ask other families. That's a big, huge aspect in trying to get some coverage to help pay for the costs.
Excellent points, Dana. And Tracy and Richie, I want to ask if you want to add to that, and also if you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience before I turn the program back over to Joan.
I thought that was a great answer, Dana. I totally agree with you. And I would just say, find your advocacy organization. Both the head of the FDA and NIH have said in separate comments that they would hate to have a rare disease where there's not an active advocacy organization, because sometimes science and medicine can't help us. we can help each other and help move the field forward. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, and really nothing I can add beyond what Dana and Tracy added. I think that was fantastic. A great way to wrap this up. Really appreciated the conversation and look forward to catching up with everybody soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dana, Tracy, and Richie, for the very engaging conversation and valuable information for our audience. It was a pleasure working with you.
Likewise, Marcia. Thank you.
And I will, at this point, send it back to Joan and have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Marcia, for moderating a very lively conversation. I echo your comments. Thank you, Richie and Tracy and Dana, for sharing all this wonderful information. And just on this slide, you'll see some additional resource links and recommendations from our various organizations. To confirm, we will be sending out the webinar recording link with the presentation slides. As an attendee, you will also receive this very helpful and easy to read resource. It's an infographic on the different types of questions to ask before the clinical trial ends, and you will receive it in the post follow-up email. And we do hope, as I mentioned in the very beginning, that the goal of this second webinar was to have a few key takeaways, and the key takeaways just to reinforce, what happens when the clinical trial is completed, things to consider and the questions to ask, how to advocate for yourself or the patient that you're caregiving for, and that hopefully the panelists and on today's webinar was able to address these key takeaways and even more that you're able to apply to your own life. Definitely thank you to Nord for moderating and collaborating on this webinar, but also thank you to not only Marcia, but to Richie, Tracy, and Dana for also collaborating and participating in the webinar and sharing their comments on the various questions that we received from the attendees. And in closing, just another thank you. Please mark your calendars for the third webinar, which is scheduled for November 10th at 12 p.m. And this will focus on what happens after participation and how you're able to pay it forward. The first webinar, again, is on our website. We will be sharing that webinar link with you as well as this second webinar link. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day and take care.